right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. I know it's been a while since our last ROS medical community meeting. Deanna has put together a nice safety presentation for us. So without further delay, I hand it over to you, Deanna.
Thank you, Tom. It's good to see a mix of faces, familiar and new faces, which are what we're looking for the ROS medical community. So I'm hoping to convince some of you, if you're not already convinced, that ROS-powered robots can be made safe, and that's drawing from experience of mine doing that in industry the last few years. If you don't know me, I worked on the ROS2 team during the early releases of ROS2, so the open ecosystem is sort of in my blood, and that's why I'm sort of co-started this community with Tom, but also I'm here today speaking is because there's a lot of impact that I, as one roboticist, can have on the whole of society if we can get more people seeing how ROS can bring medical robots to impact patients sooner by leveraging ROS. The other reason is just because for fun, really, despite having spent the last 10 years in industry and not academia, I'm an educator at heart, and so I hope to never stop learning or teaching. And so this is part of just what I get enjoyment out of, is sharing my expertise. Okay, I won't, if you have seen the ROSCON keynote from last year that I did, I won't be rehashing too much of it. Actually, majority of the 40-something minutes was about what we do at VEXEV. We're a vascular imaging robot, proudly using ROS to help us bring that impact to patients sooner. And so since the talk, we've finished our first clinical trial successfully, so it's certainly helping us to do that. And I only really touched on medical contexts, medical standards a little bit, and this is more about what happens next around the formalization of safety arguments. So what you need to know from that talk, just at a zoomed out level, is like medical standards don't require us to, for example, only use software that complies with MISRA-C, like is the case in automotive, for example. We have more flexibility than people realize. And so that's why one of the misunderstandings that I came up against as well when I started asking people about ROS's applicability in medical contexts is that some people think that only software developed under medical device standards can be used in medical devices, but it's not the case. So open source software, it may or may not be applicable for your device, but it's definitely not off limits. And it's up for you to convince the regulators for why it's been chosen. So for visibility, I have not worked on a device that has FDA clearance. I enjoy working in early stage startups. That's kind of where I spent most of my career. And so in that talk, I actually instead I cite the regulatory documents of a device that has received FDA clearance and how they justify the use of open source software in their product. So that's one of the misconceptions. I'll tell you another one, but first I'll just set the scene for what we're going to be talking about today, or like what you can expect over the next however long we have together. I'm going to talk about safety in general for a bit, and then safety specifically for a robot that we'll sort of work through the examples for. And towards the end, it will get into some real specifics, if we want it to, about actually how to form safety arguments in a way that, to me, reflects designing a mathematical proof, if that's the sort of thing you enjoy. But otherwise, just hang out in the first two sections, and I think there's a lot to learn. So the second key misunderstanding that I have seen and come up against about using ROS in any sort of safety critical context is that in order to use it, it has to be flawless. And this is dangerous because, especially having, maintained the build farm, for ROS itself, you know that it does fail in different contexts. And so if we approach it needing to be fail-proof, I think that's where a lot of people will rule it out incorrectly. So what I'm not saying in this talk, just to be clear, is that ROS is appropriate for all robots. And so in step one of designing a product, you need to decide if ROS makes sense in your robot for functional performance. And then we can talk about if it makes sense in a safety context. And so I'm focusing on step two in this talk, but there's a lot of ROSCON talks that show that ROS can be used in real-time, hard real-time, full body motion planners, for example, of humanoids. Again, not what this talk is about. You can have that discussion. If you don't end up using ROS for your functional performance, you don't need to be here. But if you have, like many of us, developed a robot that relies on ROS for getting to, the end of step one, then what happens next? So we're not going to take this top path of relying on ROS to be flawless, because it will take us a lot of time. And like I said in the previous slide, it's not necessary to rewrite ROS under medical device standards, as in my experience at least. We're going to instead rely on this concept of fail-safe, which is that even if something goes wrong at or above the ROS layer, your system can still be safe. And if you haven't come across this notion of fail-safe, it's like it's very eye-opening and enlightening. And to ground it, here's an example from our work at Vexev. I mean, it's cartoonized a bit because I've given some other talks around like pragmatic safety and just how that lets startup innovators get back to innovation rather than spending too much time on safety. But conceptually, we have an ultrasound scanning robot where we've designed our own manipulator. So we have planning that gets sent to the embedded controller and eventually to our motors. And so if you're taking the approach of making this flawless, you're going to want to put a watchdog on the comms. You're going to want, rejection of unsafe movement commands. You're going to use like heavy use of simulation to make sure you're never sending anything unsafe. You're going to put supervisors at the host level so that you can tell if something falls over, life cycle, whatnot. And this will take you a lot of time if you're doing it for the purpose of safety. You might need this for your functional performance, but in my case, like not so far. And so what we exploit instead at Vexev is the notion of a safe worst case, which I find an easier concept to integrate than like fail-safe, but the same idea is like, even if something goes wrong, you can't harm someone. It's not necessarily useful, but okay. So the robot or the motor on the right is dangerous and the motor on the left is not. You could leave that with the child and not worry about it. And so this is the difference. This is sometimes you have actually a design choice here of which motor to include in your actual mechanism. And an intentional choice about this will not just impact the safety at the motor level, but impact the entire roadmap of your product if it saves you from implementing all of the safety higher up. So this is what we're going to design together for a different robot. I'm very open where I can be about the work that we do at Vexev. And for this level of detail, we're going to pick something else to discuss. So this is a proof of concept from a research paper that people have published using the UR5 of using the UR5 in the context of a rehabilitation robot. So I want us from here on to pretend that we are roboticists at this company. Each of us has been hired as the first dedicated roboticist in a spin-off that is, our job is to turn a proof of concept into a medical device. And so this is a hypothetical company, but I've really been in this situation. And what so this was for a skin printing robot that I'll tell you more about when it's relevant. But the questions that you're going to get asked on your first day is like, hey, so should we be changing the robot? This was just, we kind of used what was in the lab. Is this going to work for our long-term product? And should we keep using ROS? And so just to have some more interaction than you can have in a 1,000-person like robotics conference talk, I'm going to ask you guys now, just throw in the chat what your intuition is about those two questions. Today, in this moment, there's no right answer. I am curious where you're currently leaning. Please share in the chat for us all. And while you do that, I'll annotate that the reason that there's no right answer is because, in my experience, the approach to this will depend on the robots that you've worked on in the past. Maybe you've worked in a surgical context, for example, and so you'll see everything as surgical level risk. And the advice that you've gotten from different regulatory consultants, maybe they see everything as surgical level risk, even if it isn't. And more broadly, just because there can be a lot of correct answers depending on what medical context you're working in. All right, I'll let them trickle in. But again, a variety of answers. Okay, some people are saying it depends, and I agree with that as a sentiment. But I've been in the position before where it's like, I'm pretty sure you definitely need to change your robot, and you definitely need to stop using ROS. And now I don't feel that way about either of these. Okay. The other thing that's relevant, so I've intentionally chosen a startup hypothetical context here because that's what I enjoy working in, and because I think there are unique constraints there that you have to be intentional about the way that you sequence things. If you're one roboticist, you can't jump from start to finish. It's just, you'll have to be conscious about your sequencing. So important to note, when management asks you these sorts of questions, they're really asking like the end state of the product. Long term, should we change robot? Long term, will we remove ROS? And like, when in the sequence from proof of concept to product is that going to happen? And so just to give you a glimpse into like my opinion on these things is that you can't leave it to the end. That's obvious. You can't do it straight at the beginning because you don't know. And you have to, how medical device development works is that you're going to actually do iteration through trials and testing with customers or like end users to refine your prototype. And not just at the functional level, but also at the safety level. So like, you don't know at the beginning what safety you need to design because you don't necessarily know what product you're designing, but we can make a rough guess. I'll show you, that's sort of step one, is just take a stab at it. But just to show you why I have the opinion that devices iterate quickly is because this is a skin printing robot that I worked on. I joined as technically employee number one, but we were a spin-off. So like employee number two is definitely the first roboticist and the only roboticist for a while when we were using the UR5 and a proof of concept print head. At some point we upgraded the robot first because I decided that, yes, we did need to switch to the LBR med in the surgical context that we're in. And at some point we updated the print head gets revised, and just conceptually all of this time, we're also learning about what level of safety we can tolerate, or the burn surgeons that you see can tolerate. And so what we actually need to design from the safety front as well. Okay, back to our physiotherapy robot. So the hazards for this robot, For the skin print, for the ultrasound scanning robot I mentioned in the ROS-con talk, it's like push, crush, jab. And there are similar ones here because it's also using a manipulator where it's like you want to be thinking about how we are going to mitigate a collision risk from the robot whacking someone, a crush risk from the gripper, that it could grab someone. We're using it in a physiotherapy context so that it's intentionally grabbing limbs and moving them. You need to make sure it doesn't dislocate, rip someone's limb off. And there's a subtle one that I've included just because it's different to the others, how you would deal with this one of like extended gentle compression. But these are the things that throughout the rest of the talk in this context will actually be designing the architecture and the actual safety arguments for how we're going to manage each of these robot hazards. But to start off with, it has to, of course, be pretty rough guess because you haven't done that iteration that I mentioned. But the five steps, they're gonna show up as we go along. And before I get there, I'm gonna launch, let's see. With any luck, there's a poll that shows up for you here, just for me to understand. Are you guys working in a startup or big corporation? Where's the energy in this room and your experience? Thank you. The responses are coming in hot. Okay. All right. So far, the majority, I don't think it shows you. Closing it now, just in the interest of time. I'm seeing the majority are working in established companies and have some experience with industrial robots, but not all. And there are some fellow startup friends here. So the reason that I asked a question about the industrial robots is because when I moved into medical devices, did not have like experience with industrial robots in the real world. I had run the ARIAP competition for NIST, that's industrial robots in simulation, but in the real world, it makes a difference. And the reason is because industrial robotics actually have a lot of safety risks in the real world that they've already tackled. So if you've been exposed to this before, then the notion of safety is not actually that intimidating or overwhelming, but I had not, and that's why I'm like motivated to enlighten people. So industrial people have managed to convince society or whoever is relevant that some very dangerous robots can actually be made safe. And the general way that they manage to do that is by having conditional behavior of these robots. So for example, emergency stop, conditional behavior that's triggered by safety rated devices, safety rated logic input and output, safety rated communication, connecting them. So in the bottom right, there's a safety rated SICK LiDAR, for example. And those are being monitored by completely independent monitoring from what the robot is supposed to do. And this is the same format that we will fundamentally use in the medical robot that we're talking about here and the ones that I've like used in practice. And sometimes you literally use an industrial robot in a medical robot. There are robots that use the UR5, medical robots that use the UR5 literally. Okay, so just to explain what's on the screen here, this is a safety concept example from KUKA themselves of saying like how you can leverage their robots in to make this hypothetical situation safer. So the two that I'll call out, one is like the robot is moving back and forth, and if there's someone there that puts their hand in the way, it will crush them. And so one of the two mitigations on this page is that if it enters one of these yellow boxes, it will slow down. And that means that there's still a crush risk in that box, but a person has more time to react. So that mitigates the actual crush risk. And this I point out because there's no sensing involved in that. It is just clever. And the other is to detect unexpected behavior. Say that you're actually operating a bone saw in those boxes. It's maybe not enough to just slow the bone saw down. You need to detect when somebody has crossed into that work cell using this LiDAR and shut the bone saw off. And so those are two different approaches. One actually lessens the likelihood of somebody getting in the way of the robot, and the other lessens the impact if they were to end up in a tricky situation. So figure out which is which if you want, but common theme for the whole talk is that there's no assumption here that things are going right. There's no assumption that the people stay outside of the work cell or that the robot could never possibly hurt someone. There's an acknowledgement, and we consciously tackle it, sometimes in some very creative, clever ways. All right. So now let's get into the steps for our robot. 5 steps once you've done your literature review to calm down on what industrial robots are doing. So I mentioned that first you're just going to do a rough plan. You don't need to know exactly how you're going to mitigate each of the hazards that I enumerated, but a rough plan will help you buy the right products to start your initial prototypes. So things to keep in mind at this stage is don't forget that not everything needs to be as safe as everything else. So how safe a surgical robot has to be is different, or just collision avoidance when there's an open wound is different to the collision avoidance that I have in an imaging robot that isn't meant to be used for open wounds, right? So don't forget that, because it can be very tempting, at least for my personality, to over-engineer things, but being pragmatic will get us to market sooner. And then what you have to think about here is how will you get to that safe worst case that I mentioned with the motors as an example. So the format for this, and we'll give concrete examples on the next couple slides, and I'll explain what the picture is if you haven't seen it. But we're looking to be able to say the sentence even if a super edge case, black swan risk does happen, we will still be safe. We'll still be safe because of a particular reaction that we initiate based on some monitoring, like in industrial robots. Okay, so because these are very unlikely events, black swan risk and whatnot, we can have really extreme reactions because we're also going to avoid ever getting into that situation. But the format again is you will have your code doing application level stuff, and then independently you will have in parallel monitoring of unsafe situations and a reaction that then puts it into a safe state. Okay, so this is fundamental to the use for how we're going to use ROS in a medical device. But then it's also fundamental in other industries as well. So this is an aerospace example, or an aviation example. You never intend for an airplane to lose power. Your prevention is going to be that you have a backup power module. But should both of those fail, this is off Wikipedia, and thank you, Jeff Biggs, for reference or like pointing out this very extreme example that even planes can be helped made safe. Should both power sources fail, there is a turbine that will pop out automatically and provide power to the rest of the, or like at least enough power to the vital systems of the plane. And you and I probably have never heard or seen these because we don't encounter this situation very often, if ever, I don't know. And it's because of the prevention of not just having robust electronics, but also having a backup power source as well. These are staged, like layered responses, but the fact that they're there then can help us relax and really just keep designing innovative things. Otherwise, perhaps without this, you'd never get approval for the notion of autopilot, as an example. All right, specifically for our robot, what are we going to do? These are the risks. I'm going to, as the robotics lead, dictate the direction that we'll be taking for these different risks at a high level. So there's a collision risk with the physiotherapist, with the patient. We're going to use a Cobot, and it could be the UR5, it could be the KUKA LBR Med, it could be a KUKA IWA. But Cobot specifically because it is designed to have like this collision detection, and this is established. You know, there's an example YouTube video here. Go look at it so I don't have to explain it, but it'll show you how to configure collision detection on the KUKA LBR Med. Done. All you have to do is buy that robot, but in some instances, that's the right trade-off to make. Okay, next, crash risk from the gripper. There's directions we can take on this. I'm going to dictate that the direction we will be taking is to make an inherently safe gripper attachment. I'm going to hand that to our mechanical team as a requirement. They're going to make a custom end effector anyway to grab onto limbs, and I'm going to ask them that even if something were to request an extreme crushing motion, that still can't hurt a patient. And that's going to free me up at the robotics software level to not worry about that risk anymore. So what else? Dislocation. Dislocation will happen when the robot is moving unintended and the gripper is closed. So we only need, if the gripper is open, there's no dislocation risk. But we need a way to detect if the gripper is closed that is sufficiently safety rated. So I'm going to require that the gripper is designed with some detection of when it's closed, and that detection is actually whatever format is needed to feed into the safety module that comes with the industrial Cobot. Okay. And the final one, extended gentle compression leads to nerve damage. This one is not an instantaneous thing that's easy to detect, and so we're going to tackle that in our software and firmware sort of DIY, and I'll tell you more about it later. But this is the rough plan, and so from that, I can take some architecture requirements. Oh, we've already discussed that. I can take some architecture requirements and actually put my architecture on paper and decide really what platform we're eventually going to use to then start sequencing my roadmap for how to get there. So I'll go into architecture for a minute now, but we are still working at like a rough level. Actually, I've been speaking for a while, so I'll check if there are any questions at this point, more in the like clarification realm than like taking us on a tangent. But if you have one, throw it in. got to be faster if you do. I'll pause in a minute. So to plan your architecture layers, the goal of this stage is that you know what platforms you're going to buy versus build. And there isn't a single architecture. Is a Cobot running ROS? Okay, here's where we'll answer that question. There isn't a single architecture that will make sense for every robot because it's going to depend on the risk in your specific medical context. So here's, there's two things I want to, this is the architecture proposal for the physiotherapy robot on the left. In the meantime, I'm just going to show you, this is the LBR Med that I bought for the skin printing robot. And I put the picture here so that you can see that underneath, like this is really an industrial robot. It comes with these, the same, they're called smart pads, but these like tablets that you find on industrial robots. And there is a white module at the bottom that important about like the KUKA robot is that it has 4 cores, 2 of which are dedicated to safety supervision. And for a surgical robot, that can be the way you go. It's been tested under drapes and whatnot. I have decided for this, we as individual hypothetical first employees of the physiotherapy robot have decided, okay, we can, without the surgical risk level, we can stick with a standard Cobot. Is it using ROS? How I would design it is that you're going to use ROS at your level, like the application level code, you always have to write. You can use ROS or not, but my experience is that life is easier if you do. And this is built on top of like, at some point you need to get the robot to move. If you have bought an arm, then let's go the path of using the arm vendor, Universal Robots or KUKA, for example, their movement SDK, so point-to-point planning or whatever servoing demos they include that you can build off. And you've bought their arm, so that's their hardware, in contrast to us at Vexev making our own manipulator. Really why we are grabbing, or what we're leveraging by using a sort of industrial Cobot, or the LBR Med, I don't think markets itself as an industrial robot, but it's a variation of, is the safety modules that come in that lower level. So I mention it here because that's going to dictate some of our requirements when we then go to include our gripper into this architecture. So I mentioned in our like high-level safety strategy is that we're going to include information about whether the gripper is open or closed into these safety cores that I spoke about. And in order to do that, you need to use a particular communication protocol that's dictated by the vendor. The one that I am familiar with is Safety over EtherCAT. And so that's what they're already using to do the collision detection internally in the robot. And if we want to extend that and use our own safety functionality, then we're going to use that protocol. And this you pass to your, like, whoever is developing the embedded electronics. Now you have a requirement that you can pass to them. So that's an example of how we can, of what our architecture can look like. We're using ROS to some extent, but it's sort of contained to the top layer, and the rest we're getting off the shelf from the vendor. An alternative, not the alternative, an extreme alternative is what we do at Vexev that I think is surprising to many people, which is that, yes, we have our ultrasound scanning specific code at the top using ROS, designing whatever actions are appropriate. And then we have a movement layer that's using ROS. We have our own manipulator, and so we include a URDF and leverage what we can get off the shelf from the community to avoid creating it ourselves. So we have a movement layer using ROS. We even have the embedded layer using micro ROS. And where we keep ROS out is in the safety modules, which we still have flexibility over, like just, this is where we make the motors from the like angle grinder to the hand fan, but that there's flexibility there of electrically mitigating them, firmware, like limiting the current that they draw from firmware, or doing some safety mitigations in software. And in practice, we do all three, but there's still design flexibility in that. So importantly here, I have enough information to communicate to the rest of the team that what we do or don't have to purchase in terms of embedded system communication modules. For example, if we're working with EtherCAT, then that will be a very different embedded topology. So that's from my medical experience. It's a similar thing in, and there are medical robots that do mobile navigation. I put this example here of a different but relatable architecture in mobile robots from Otto. And this is Ryan Garapi from Roscon in Japan, where essentially the same sort of point is being made, that you have your ROS stack, and at the bottom you have an off-the-shelf safety-rated LiDAR. You have that flexibility of what safety you DIY and what safety you buy as off the shelf. At some point, you're always going to need it integrated into your own system yourself. Nobody has developed your robot before. And even the LBR Med, it is an integrated safety plus robot arm, but it is marketed as a medical device component because you can't call something a medical device without actually a final end use, a final application, because medical devices only exist in the context of like a risk assessment, pretty much. So this premise, I'll pause here so that you can tell me what you have heard, but fundamentally, well, I won't finish my sentence so that you can finish it instead. Like, what have you learned about how you can use ROS in a device, even if it's a medical device? Please now practice the argument at a very high level about how you can make an architecture that includes ROS and also is used in a medical context. Because cool things are coming in. Beyond this point, the talk is about details. And so if this is a reasonable time for it, we could wrap up here if we want to, of like architect your system in a way that, as people are saying, like even if ROS fails, we'll have independent safety monitoring that saves us. Safety functions not using ROS. Yes, okay, we're getting it. So then what are they doing if they're not using ROS? And this is where, like, you probably don't need to know the details depending on where you are in your medical device design. I am past the point of doing the architecture and saying, okay, our plan is to use ROS. It's like, what happens next? And so I'll show you what that involves in the future steps. But up until now, you know what platforms you're going to use, and you should, and you should phase in the safety during these prototype phases so that you de-risk what you're relying on. So if I, for example, am relying on inherently safe gripper design so that I can use one platform, like robot platform, over another, then I need to make sure early enough in my roadmap that that is true, that I can actually make an inherently safe gripper. So here we will be prototyping safety features, but they don't have to, but it's more about the functionality of like, will we be able to execute an emergency stop? Okay. Will we be able to embed EtherCAT somehow in our embedded modules? Okay, looks good. And so prototype, but you're still going to learn what the product actually needs and how much risk we can tolerate as we go along. So this can be a long phase here. And my point is that it's a few years that you're learning about what you're actually needing to design before you get to step 4 of 5, which is like, tell me the numbers. At some point, you actually have to say, is it safe enough? Or like answer the question to your regulatory team, is it safe enough? They want to know. You've told people that you're going to keep the force, you're going to mitigate or like limit the force of the gripper. And now they want to know, well, what's the force limit going to be? Because we need to design like the VNV test suite. And so at some point you need to take it from a rough thing to something specific. And this is not an engineering decision by itself. This is actually something that depends on, like I said, how much risk you can tolerate, like how much crush risk you can tolerate. You need to meet in the middle of like, there are functional requirements of the gripper and there are safety requirements, and you need to be able to meet both. But it's also like bringing in clinicians of like, hey, how much force can be withstood before the physiotherapy, for example, is actually undone? And maybe the answer is you can be rougher with patients than you realize because physiotherapists themselves maybe have to be rough with a patient. It can actually be a very interesting outcome when you work together, and you should have been working together from the beginning, but now we need to put numbers on things. Where it gets I think interesting, the next few slides are things that I just personally find interesting about this work, is that if somebody comes, you need to turn their clinical wisdom into your actual numbers and requirements. And there's some negotiation that I like to think of as strategy. So if the clinical team is going to say, I would like the robot to never hurt anyone. And never hurting anyone is challenging when you're talking about these safety, very low level safety systems that by default, they don't understand about the context of, if you're grabbing an arm, if you're grabbing a thigh. And so there's a lot to encompass in that. You've got a broad patient population, never hurt anyone. Okay, but sometimes we want to use it on children. Like there's a negotiation that happens. And the most interesting negotiation that I can think of for the physiotherapy robot is like, instead, as a safety lead, I'm gonna, because robotics lead can also be the safety lead in a small enough startup, I'm gonna say, okay, how about we definitely never seriously hurt someone, but probably won't ever sort of hurt someone. And so this sounds like we have agreed to the same thing, but it makes a really big difference in the implementation details, because what this means is that we can actually strategically delegate just the extreme severe risk to, say, electrical or dumb low level or like oblivious low level safety monitoring to take care of the extreme risk. And then the residual risk of like, well, maybe we kind of hurt someone. You can use firmware, software, like less safety intensive parts of your system to tackle the residual risk. So this is what I call strategic delegation of like step down risk mitigation. It sounds like layering, but the difference is that each time they're tackling less intense risks. I can go into it more if you like. But as I share in the next few slides, like strategic design choices around safety that I've come up with for the physiotherapy robot, you know, I'm genuinely curious if you've seen some clever tricks yourself and are able to share with me in particular, because this is the part that I find very similar to designing a mathematical proof, and the more proofs that you get exposed to, hang on, I have to mute someone. The more that you get exposed to, the easier it is to then design your own proofs. All right, so we're going to accumulate some tricks based on how I would tackle each of these risks. Hazard 1 was just a collision risk. I already told you we're going to use just a collision monitoring safety stop for the from the Cobot. Now, for the crash risk, I said we're going to use an inherently safe gripper. And even beyond this, you have some choices. So an inherently safe gripper to me, I worked with a now robot in a educational robotics application that was working with children. And the now has like three, I'm looking for this one. Yeah, the now has 3 fingers. And so suppose that each of these fingers were individually actuated, which isn't the case for the now, but suppose that it were. Then you have a choice in order to convince someone that you have limited the gripper force. There's a choice there of like guaranteeing genuinely that the force of the combined 2 or 3 pincers, if they're called that, can not exceed a particular amount. Or there's a trick here that we can exploit where actually assume that each of the individual fingers is bounded. And if the individual fingers bounded gets you what you need, then you don't need to look any further. So here, what I mean is you want to guarantee that the bucket doesn't have enough water, or like it has water below a particular amount. That's a force that's collectively applied to the object. But it might be easier in cases that I've seen, it is actually easier to just limit the individual glasses of water. You know that each glass of water is going to have less than its individual capacity. And if you can get away with assuming that each glass of water has its full capacity, then you don't really need to measure the live value of the sum of the 3 glasses of water, because you can guarantee mathematically that it's going to be less than the combination. You're going to assume something is worse than it actually is, in this case that each of the glasses are full, and see if you can get that by your like, if that meeting that safety argument also meets your functional requirements, then okay, agree to the stricter safety argument if it gets you back to features faster. So monitoring them individually gives you simplicity, and it also no, that's the advantage there, is that you don't need to measure the combination and put a force torque sensor inside if you can just limit the inputs. All right. So another trick here, we have designed this gripper ourselves in the hypothetical physiotherapy robot. So let's exploit the fact that we've designed it ourselves by choosing motors that inherently make a safe gripper. And if we can do that, then especially if we can push that safety to the electrical supply to those motors, then firmware can fail as much as it wants, and we won't ever end up having like glasses of water overfull. So in this context, firmware will still monitor the current supply to the robot gripper, but it's mitigating the residual risk. So this is what I was talking about on the previous slide. These tricks around like bringing things to safe worst case, this is how you do it. And this is an absolute game changer for if you want to use ROS, because what this means for your overall system is that when someone says, how do you know that ROS won't fail? You say, even if it were to, the gripper, even if it were to request full force gripper closure, it can't cause any harm. So there are some other reasons why you want to use firmware versus electrical. I'd be very happy to talk about them, but it's more detailed than necessary right now. For now, let's move to the next hazard. So we said that we're going to manage the dislocation hazard by detecting when the gripper is closed and putting that into the industrial rated like safety modules. We had a choice there that we could have there was an option where we could actually, we're exploiting something that this is only an unsafe state if the gripper is closed. If the gripper is open, there's some risk from the robot moving quickly, but it's not a dislocation risk. So the trick that I pulled out here is like, this is a general practice of interlocks of like, if you're not expecting two things to be in parallel, then exploit them as interlocks. And in this case of like, if the gripper's open, you can move full speed where in the context of dislocation. We're only interested in when the gripper is closed. You should be able to figure out from that same video about the KUKA safety, like how to make a conditional movement based on sensor input. But you might need to design your own sensor. And so the next tip that I have is like, you have a choice on how robust you want this is gripper closed sensor to be. And the more robust it is, the more expensive it is going to be to build or buy in either case. And so you want to keep the risk in mind when you're like making the speccing the robustness here. But a trick that you can exploit, even if you want to use a low fidelity gripper closed sensor, there's extreme safety rated sensors that have 2-3 channels in them. But you could probably get away with a simple one if you are willing to tolerate the false positive of it saying that the gripper is closed when really it isn't. And so this is the premise of fail-safe has come back, that it's like, you don't need a flawless sensor input, but you need to make sure that when it's incorrect, it doesn't make your system less safe. It might be a nuisance, but that it doesn't make it less safe. So that's actually intentional circuitry design if you're making that yourself, or just speccing products if you're buying them off the shelf. Okay, keep the interesting, now that you have more examples of like what I find interesting things, please share some that you've come across with me so that I can learn from you. In the meantime, this is the last one. It is harder to describe. I'm going to skip over it in the interest of time, but I do find these very interesting. So stick around and we can talk about it later. But I won't skip this one. Even if we had, so conceptually we've designed something that we want to save the patient from the robot freezing on them for longer than it was supposed to and leading to nerve damage. And so for that, you can implement different protective measures, but don't forget that humans are around, trained people are around, And there's this notion of like a Swiss cheese model for safety layers that you can have flaws in the different layers if another layer is going to pick it up. So just don't forget that if there's someone nearby, or you can sound an alarm that brings someone nearby, you don't need individual safety layers to necessarily be flawless. Humans exist and you can leverage them in your safety argument. All right. More to say on that, but for now, here's a summary of some of the things that you can put in your safety argument toolbox. And this is for the step of like actually formalizing what numbers need to go into your implementation and testing of safety features. And then at this point, you know you've done it right if the formal argument essentially says that you've mitigated the risks sufficiently. I won't get into how you can do this. There's a lot of information that exists. The relevant words that you'll want is risk assessments and FMEAs. You can go back to Ryan's talk where he'll show you like, okay, a dangerous thing slowly with successive mitigations being implemented gets down to being considered not a dangerous situation anymore. That's what eventually we need to convince our team and regulatory bodies like the FDA. But for most of us, it's a long way off. For now, I'll wrap up just to say that like in this zoomed out level, this conceptually is how you can build confidence that ROS can be used in safety critical robots. You don't get it for free. ROS is not flawless. But if you design intentionally your system so that even if it fails, black swan risk won't cause you more risk than you can tolerate in your device, then you can keep ROS in, provided it meets your functional performance. So I'll say again, we're not through any of this pretending that risks don't exist in your product or in the ROS layer. You need to be conscious of them, build confidence around mitigations that you have in place. Yes, it could fail, but this is what would happen, and this is why we think it would still be okay. Document that, convince auditors, and wish me luck, and I wish you'd like the same. So please share any questions that you have. I'll be around for a few moments to chat. I really enjoy chatting to people about this, in part because I work in a small startup where there aren't many other people to bounce ideas off.
Thanks, Deanna. I guess we have a little time for some questions.
I got a direct.
No, it's amazing.
Oh, cool.
Thanks so much for. I mean, I don't have a question right now, but it was great to see, and thanks for sharing the slides today.
Thanks. I got a question written to me directly, or two actually. So one was if I have any examples of like over engineering safety, which I sort of mentioned. For me, the one that comes to mind is that the benchmark that sometimes we use is like not hurting someone, whereas the benchmark that's appropriate to use is what would happen if our device weren't in the market. And so compare yourself to how actually people are performing these procedures. And in the ultrasound scanning example, how that shows up is we do ultrasound scans for the purpose of dialysis, getting people access to dialysis. And dialysis patients actually they already need to tolerate some discomfort to get these scans. And so if we hold ourselves to the design standard of like pain-free ultrasound scans, that might make a better product, but it will definitely be a slower product to make. And so we need to weigh up that trade-off of if we want to prevent people access to these scans, there isn't enough access to the scans at the moment, which is why our robot has a market. And if it's worth, you know, avoid reaching for the stars of like pain-free scanning in order to, or like at the downside of delaying people access to the ultrasound scans. Yeah, so somebody is summarizing of like determine what good enough is, and this person has mentioned for the risk assessment, or through the risk assessment decide what's good enough. But this is actually, I don't feel like that shows up in the risk assessment necessarily, unless it is informed by your clinical and real wisdom of like, look at how people are actually behaving in the clinical context. Because you might ask a clinician to inform your risk assessment and they'll say, please make it pain-free. That would be great. But ask a different clinician who's more realistic and they'll say, nah, these patients can tolerate more than you can ever imagine. They are robust because of the other procedures that they have to go through. Okay, more questions. Hope that helped. Do you want to pick one, Tom? It's
Let's see. So there's a question about, do we still need to do an FMEA analysis for applications if they're inherently safe, is guaranteed by physical design? So did you have to do a DFMEA, Deanna, for your design inherent?
Yeah, exactly. I feel like this is the way that you convince someone that it has been made inherently safe, is that, okay, you pull the threads of like what would happen if it were to fail, and then say not much, and that's how we've hung up on that. So you have like the high level FMEA, and then for each of the features, each of the safety features that you implement, you also want to see, you make assumptions in each of the. So I was assuming, for example, that if you were to assume that you're always going to correctly monitor the force on a gripper, what happens if your car, and you're inferring that from the current that gets sent to the motors, what happens if the current reporting that's being reported to the firmware is incorrect? You need to trace all of that. And if it's been implemented in the electrical layer as well, what if you have something that's physically limiting the current or cutting off the current if it hits a threshold? What if that current limiting fails? There are chips that you can get, and if you buy like safe chips that are sold by vendors that care about functional safety or are used by people that care about functional safety, then they'll include their failure mode of even the component. And so a chip that's monitoring the current that gets sent to a motor, you can look at the failure modes of that chip, and you want to make sure that they are loud failures that you can detect and put it into a safe state. And in that case, you can tolerate those failures.
All right. Looking through see if we have some other questions.
I also got another private one around ROS-2. They're talking about the weaknesses. If I have opinions about the weaknesses of ROS-2, so far I think the weaknesses of ROS-2 is that people have a negative reaction towards it because it originally, well, ROS-2 didn't come out of a research environment. ROS-1 did, and ROS-2 is very intentionally designed to not be ROS-1. But I think one of the downsides of it being a different version of the same product is that it still carries the baggage of people thinking that ROS-1 is not used in industry context, and these days that's pretty far from it. It's very far from the truth, and so I think that's one of the philosophical drawbacks of ROS2 that we're, as a community, still coming to overcome. But you can find lots of different talks, panels, examples from ROSCon, or go and meet them yourselves, of successful robotics companies that deploy robots in industry using even ROS1 and ROS2. On the technical level, I think this is an interesting question, because I would believe that there's somebody like, oh my gosh, how is she not saying this? Some people, for example, they're not satisfied with something in the fact that DDS is used underneath the RMW layer, and so they're excited about Zeno being an option as an alternative RMW implementation. This doesn't excite me because I don't have any lived experience of DDS being a problem in systems that I've worked with. And so the fact that there aren't downsides that come to my mind is not because there aren't downsides, but because downsides are a context-specific thing. And if you're trying to achieve something else with ROS2, it might not at all be what you want, or at least the ROS2 DDS combination might not be what you want, but it certainly works fine for me, and I don't, at the moment, have an interest in switching to Zeno, for example.
So, Deanna, there was a question. Did you use fault tree analysis in your work?
Yeah, so I came across, yes is the answer. I didn't know about fault tree analysis. The reason that I'm here is because, like, in this session, is because I learned these skills accidentally. And so what I intentionally learned from Jeff Biggs when he shared a presentation with the ROS medical community was GSN, graphical state notation. Now it's not state, graphical safety notation. It might not even be that, but GSN is the acronym. And so I made a GSN diagram for some of our formal safety arguments that I could run by our team. And I was thrilled that the clinicians were able to engage with these diagrams because it documented different assumptions that we were making. And somebody engaging with that diagram that I work with, that has experience in autonomous cars, said, I haven't seen this before, but I have seen fault trees. And so that's what I then switched to for looking at what was the residual risk. So if you're in a situation, I didn't cover the situation about mitigating the extended compression, but I did mention that a person was relevant for catching one of the gaps in the safety argument. And the way that I come across that is like, okay, I find it really useful to use a fault tree to specify there is residual risk here, and all of these other things have to have gone wrong. Can we as a group tolerate this residual risk given that it is so niche? And that's a really important tool for kind of negotiation is the word that comes to mind, but it's a bit, it's the regulatory team in my company. We are the same team, it's not really, we're not adversaries, but we don't speak the same language. And so in that way we can, it feels like a negotiation sometimes. And the fault tree analysis helps us get aligned on like, yeah, no, this is safe enough.
Oh yeah, and GSN is goal structuring notation.
Thanks.
Um,
I love if everyone, look, I have become the relative safety expert in my network, but I would be part of why I'm here is because I'd love for people to pick flaws in anything that I have said and to be like, I can't believe you didn't mention this very obvious thing. Did you know that there's a textbook that describes everything you said? Because truly I have learned these things from first principles, and I would have loved to have them written out as a textbook.
Well, I guess David just said there's a quantified FTA provides that. I guess is that, oh, that's the probably to the question above it. Do you know a good way to calculate the probability of occurrence of this harm? So, yeah, I guess, oh, go ahead, Deanna.
Oh, well, I'm interested in your, we should get you answering the questions as well. You have, Tom, for reference, has experience in bringing medical robots to FDA clearance, which is beyond the stage that I've gotten them to. So I'll say my insight from like the naive perspective and then throw to you. I don't have an example for the physiotherapy or like the crush risk, but if you can identify the reason that somebody would get crushed is because, for example, a particular component fails, then those components sometimes have, like I was saying, the documented failure rate, and they're kind of quantified in mean time before failure. I think there's a few different variations on that. And so you can use that to make statistical assessment of like, okay, if we have this many robots in production, then this is how often we can expect a crush failure from this particular failure of these components.
So Tom,
Yeah, go ahead,
one of
Norm.
the things I was kind of pointing out earlier, the 61508 safety standard now has a variant that they pushed into robotics, but for medical, the 61508 still applies. That gets into determining what's called safety integrity level, whether it's continuous duty, instantaneous duty. There's 8 different parts to that standard, and they help you model this stuff, and they give you tables and things for how you assign risks, like by population, by number of units, number of components in there. They help you do, like the electrical piece of it tells you to do the bell core components analysis, so you can determine where your high failing components are. And going back to one of the first comments I made in the chat, the way we drive all this stuff is we start by doing the hazard analysis and say, well, what parts do we care about? Because to your point, Deanna, we don't care about securing every piece of the system, just the ones that could do something bad. And, and then the question is always, well, how bad is bad? If I can kill someone, or if I can hurt someone, but it's easily corrected with a Band-Aid, that's not a big deal. And so the whole point of the analysis is trying to decide, where am I going to spend my energy? And to your point, we've seen ROS successful in radiation therapy systems where they drive the patient bed and everything, and we monitor the motion separately with a camera. And we're using something that has nothing to do with the deployment of the bed or the robotics. The camera's providing the safety by doing a spatial analysis, and it's not tied to the system, but it does have a fiber optic tether to the emergency stop. So if the system, ROS, or anything were to fail, at the end of the day, it just cuts the power and the bed just stops moving. End of story.
Yeah.
So to your point, yeah, you have to determine where you want to put your energy. And that 61508 is a safety standard. It's been around for decades, and it's used in the military as well as the commercial industry, and now automotive. And it tells us, how to mathematically determine what we care about. So hopefully that kind of helps people understand where, how do we decide, is we go through that modeling, going back to requirements and to your part about what therapy are we providing, and then looking at what part can cause harm.
What's your first name?
It's Norm.
Norm, you seem like you work with Tom, do you?
I do.
We're coworkers. Yeah.
Yeah, no.
Norm's actually, oh, go ahead.
It reminds me of how ROS-2, I think the particular NASA mission ended up being sunset, but they decided to use ROS-2 in the next lunar rover mission, and that surprised a lot of people. But it was not for the rover itself, it was for the ground controls. And I think you've brought a medical
my friend Mikey,
example
who
of
used
that.
to work, my friend Mikey, who works here, went down to Florida to champion that activity. And underneath at the bottom of the system, the safety system was done with an FPGA with a zinc ultra scale.
Yeah,
so
and so
they offloaded the safety into an electrical component.
That's it. It's a sandwich of that
So at
it
the end of the
doesn't
day,
die.
to your point, you know, so firmware, in this case, is FPGA software, so it's still firmware, was the part that determined, you know, safe motion, start, stop, you know, redundant sensors. So you use electrical sensors and then optical sensors as a combination. So if you have electrical problem, theoretically, the optical sensor is still operating. And so, yeah, so for aerospace and going back to your aircraft thing, I worked in the space shuttle program, and we always assumed the electrical system could fail and the hydraulic system could fail. And when the shuttle was going to land, there was a third fail safe to put the wheels down. It was a hand crank. You could go in the cargo bay and crank the wheels down by hand in case you've had electrical and hydraulic failure.
Yeah, so maybe you can relate
So-
to this of like part of I skipped over it, but it's like sometimes when you're designing these really extreme risk mitigations, you have to be very careful of the marketing of them, because if somebody hears that and thinks we're going to have to hand crank the landing gear, it's like, no, 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 you won't have to do that.
Well, that again,
But
we were assuming that you lost your hydraulic lines, that you lost your electric motors and all your power. And you know what? In one of those shuttle instances, that did happen, but unfortunately, the entire vehicle was destroyed. But
oh,
you know,
wow.
it's just one of those you try to determine in every worst case scenario. It doesn't have power. It can't go up and around. It can't fly around again and come in for another approach. It has to land the first time every time.
Yes, I know. And I think about it when I was watching Apollo 13, I was thinking about that because I argue for like, okay, make it fail safe. It's inconvenient if our robot were to stop mid-operation, but we'll survive. And I was thinking, I think there are contexts where you can't just you really need it being very unlikely that you hit fail safe as your actual safety strategy. If you're off in space, you're gonna need just robustness from the beginning, and you can get that through redundancy, but
Yeah, they did
it's
that through three-way redundancy because all at the time you had 8-bit microprocessors and 4K and 8K E-squared proms to store your software on. So you were kind of constrained. So the only thing you could do is make it redundant. And you made all the modules so that the pilots on board could just pull things out that failed worst case and just go with the ones that still ran.
yeah, David's called this fail operational, and so
Yeah, it's called fail operational, exactly.
love it. I love, like, this is new vocabulary for me, still building it out.
Well, fail safe means if you don't know what it's not safe, you stop. Right, you go no further. But fail operational, like a train that's running or a plane that's coming down, it has to keep running. Like you can't just say, "Oh, the engine's out of control. Let's turn the engines off." No, well, okay, so
I think
planes,
that's
you know.
I think the I don't know how many people in this room will work on space shuttles anytime soon, but autonomous cars, that's what I think about
Yeah, so
as
that
the
so you
example
know,
in robotics, autonomous robotics that
well,
we're
the
not interested
warehouse
in.
robotics is big now. So I mean, you know, it started in aerospace, but now you're right. It's the self-driving cars, right? We're going to have flying cars soon. I mean, they're already prototyping things. It's just a matter of a decade or two before the FAA has a way to control, regulate it. Warehouse autonomy is going on.
Yeah, but warehouse autonomy, for the
Autonomous.
most part, I think you could hit it an e-stop and just be inconvenient. But
Well, if you think
if you're on
about
the
the
middle of the
Amazon,
highway, then
I'm thinking about the Amazon things where we have the bot carts running around the floor, bringing stacks of things for people who are packing boxes. So the bots are co-resident with the people. You know, so they need vision and bump sensors in there. They don't want to run into each other or the people they're trying to help.
exactly.
Yeah, yeah, actually, yeah, 10.218 just got rewritten this past year. So there's a whole bunch of new safety related requirements now for industrial, as which is also applying to warehouse. So things in the past that, you know, now they have to start worrying about some of the stuff that we've been dealing with in medical robotics and DoD and stuff before that. So it's catching up to just industrial robotics.
Well, I was gonna say the industrial stuff used to be the things were behind a concrete wall and a big metal fence, and people weren't allowed to go into the space while the robots were moving. But that's changing because now bots are co-resident with people standing next to them. So yeah, they need to be a little more on the safe side.
Well, while you're here, Norma, I have a question for you because I am curious what the most interesting fail. So I have this like mental framework of you can make anything safe if you can detect when it has gotten into like a hairy situation and then deploy some action that brings it to a safe
Yep.
state. And we're just talking about how stop is not always a safe state. And I'm curious what the most interesting non-stopped safe state action you've seen is.
So it's interesting you mentioned that. So a lot of our systems, we design what's called a system integrity service, which is basically a watchdog on steroids. And so you monitor different subsystems and you monitor their progress. Like you have some idea of what workflow and what sequences look like, and you monitor that things are moving the way they're supposed to in the timeline they're supposed to adhere to. Right. And then so things so going back to your DDS, I like things like DDS because we can have multiple subscribers and I can journal and I can watch the message traffic flow. So I don't participate in it, but I can observe it and see if things are in the expected pattern that I need to see.
Yeah, but that's for detecting, but for the action that you take, what's been the most interesting non-static reaction that you've seen triggered by those sorts of watchdogs?
I'm just trying to think. So radiation therapy is probably the trickiest one where we can continue to deliver therapy. Under certain circumstances, if the beam steering, beam control, and dosage control is under control, we can continue to deliver therapy. But if we lose track of that, or we lose track of the patient bed or where we are in a certain region, then the therapy is stopped. So that's kind of a wishy-washy thing. So like we have redundant sensors. If the primaries fall off, but the secondaries are still working and we know they're under control, we continue to deliver. Right. So even though we lost a backup system, we know the primary is still okay.
Well, maybe Tom can.
Again, yeah, these are all. So this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, like starting with a hazard analysis and decomposing the system and trying to decide when is it safe. What's the safe thing to continue.
Totally. And I was going to say maybe Tom can help us convince you to share the details of the radiation treatment robot with the ROS community, ROS medical community sometime.
Yeah, so the bed is a giant KUKA. It's a 650-pound duty rated KUKA arm, right? Because you have the worst size patient on the thing that has the arm plus the bed sitting on top plus the patient. So it's just if you think about your KUKA LBR arm, just picture that thing 10 times bigger.
No, I think I have.
with
a
17
picture.
with 17 degrees of freedom.
Yeah, totally. I have a picture when I went to we won a KUKA Innovation Award, or top 5, and so I've got some pictures with these like enormous robots at the KUKA factories. Like it was quite a sight, and I was just thinking it was very strange for me actually the experience of like I owned at the time one LBR med, we as a company, and I went there and I went to the factory that had hundreds of LBR meds, and somehow it triggered this like an emotional reaction. I was like, I thought my robot was unique, and there's just a floor full of them. It was an unexpected experience.
I think a great outing would be the Tesla factory. I can imagine the amount of automation that Tesla has put in where they're the latest thing into the game. They probably have cutting edge everything.
Yeah, I learned a lot when I was in there about how to make really precision robotics, and there's a reason that sometimes it makes sense to buy those things off the shelves. They certainly have a lot of expertise in-house, and they've gone through the FDA audits themselves. So.
Yeah, no, Tom and I are huge fans of buy what you can, make the parts where you add value and then buy off the shelf when it makes sense. Because to your point, why do you want to spend 5 years trying to come up with the 3-jointed robot arm when I could just buy one and be done with it?
Yeah. Okay, well,
anyway.
All right. I have to go, unfortunately, but I hope I run into you again, Norm.
We can definitely try to get Norm on the future ROS medical community presentation.
Well, the part I want to dive into, and then Tom and I have talked about this, is that ROS is becoming safer and people are learning how to deal with it. The big push now from the FDA and the EU is cybersecurity. So like, using EtherCAT, and one of the companies we work with does multiple medical robots concurrently. So the question is, how do you secure your communications over EtherCAT? how do you authenticate your endpoints and know that they're really the endpoint that you think it is, that each bot is the right one that you think you're talking to.
Yeah, gosh, multi-robot situation. Be an interesting one because you know, for this hypothetical rehab robot, it's like, well, we got a single system. We're not doing just shut all the ports, you know, where everything is internal.
But again,
So-
what happens if you now take your robot and I'm working all 4 limbs of the patient and I'm using 2 or 3 robot arms?
Totally.
Don't I have to treat the one that's manipulating your arm differently from the one that's manipulating your leg?
Yeah. Well, that sounds like really interesting
Anyway, that'd be a fun discussion.
topic. I'll be there for it.
Okay, I'll work on setting that up.
Yeah, no, I think it'd be a fun thing to explore.
Well, thank you, everybody, and thank you, Deanna, for putting together the presentation today. I think we got a lot of good comments, and I know a lot of folks are already asking for the slides and the video. So we'll work together to get that available to people.
Yeah, hit me up at ROS-Con too if you're going there. I think we'll do something in person, so should run into each other. Otherwise,
Yeah,
join the mailing list if you want to know about that.
yeah, absolutely. So probably another birds of a feather session this year at ROS-Con at least. And so sounds good. All right. Well, thank you, everyone, and thank you, Deanna, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Tom. Bye, guys.
All right.
Thank you.